Hi everyone, thank you for listening to my presentation today. My name is Cami Christopher and I'm a kinesiology major and statistics minor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I will be presenting on the impact of physical activity trajectories on colon cancer risk. Colon cancer is a major clinical and public health concern. It is currently the third leading cause of cancer death in the United States, and in 2019 there were over 50,000 deaths and over 100,000 new cases. So, what can we do about this? We can focus on prevention. Many major health organizations, such as the National Cancer Institute, American College of Sports Medicine, and the American Cancer Society, report that physical activity is associated with a decreased risk of 13 distinct cancers. Specifically for colon cancer, various types of activities and intensity levels are associated with a decreased risk. In 2019, the American College of Sports Medicine released a report showing that compared to those who were not active, those who maintained consistent physical activity levels had a 16 to 24% decreased risk of colon cancer. And this risk reduction was consistent with other well-established risk factors, such as red meat consumption and alcohol intake. However, while it's clear that physical activity is important, there are still gaps in knowledge. For example, the exact duration and dosage of physical activity that's needed to mitigate colon cancer risk is not well established. Further, federal physical activity guidelines and the American College of Sports Medicine found that it is critical that we establish at what time point physical activity is most important. Is it early in life, throughout life, or later in life that most reduces colon cancer risk? Therefore, the purpose of my study is to evaluate whether the maintenance of and changes in physical activity levels over time are associated with colon cancer risk. So this study was a National Institute of Health study started in 1995. Over 500,000 people were mailed a baseline questionnaire, and this spanned 6 different states and 2 metropolitan areas. They were sent a risk factor questionnaire that looked at diet and physical activity and established colon cancer risk factors. Over 300,000 people responded, and then we excluded based on previous cancer history and other exclusion criteria to arrive at a baseline sample of over 298,000 people. We used this risk factor questionnaire as baseline and then did follow-up through 2011. So I came on this study and I ran the statistical analysis to generate the results. So first I ran means and frequency tables to examine the baseline characteristics of distinct physical activity trajectories. I used latent class trajectory models to identify data-driven clusters at 4 periods in time. I used the question, how often did you participate in moderate vigorous physical activity? And we assess these physical activity levels at 4 periods in time, as shown on the screen. I ran the statistical analysis in a statistical program known as SAS, and I used iterative processes to identify 6 to 8 trajectories. I then identified just 7 unique trajectories of physical activity that I will describe on the following slides. I also ran Cox proportional hazard regression to examine the association between physical activity trajectories and colon cancer risk. And I adjusted for many different types of confounding variables in multiple models. For the purpose of today, I will talk about just models 1 and 2. And model 1 looked at age and sex, or adjusted for age and sex, and model 2 adjusted for age, sex, education, smoking, alcohol intake, and processed meat consumption. So now I will show you what the trajectories looked like. So on the graph, or on this graph, on the x-axis is the age time points, so those 4 periods in time that we asked about physical activity. And on the y-axis, you will see physical activity reported in hours per week. So basically what I did is I took the 7 different trajectories and identified 3 main groups. So a maintaining physical activity, increasing physical activity, and decreasing physical activity throughout the life course. So starting with the maintainers group, you will see that group 1 maintained consistently low levels of physical activity throughout their life course, and we're using them as our referent group. Groups 2 and 3 also were in the maintainers, and group 2 maintained consistently high levels of physical activity, above that of federal and global physical activity guidelines. Group 3 were moderately active levels of physical activity throughout their life course, meeting national and global physical activity guidelines. Groups 4 and 5 were increasers, so they increased physical activity throughout their life course, with group 4 increasing their physical activity levels early on in life, and group 5 increasing their physical activity levels later on in life. Group 6 and 7 were decreasers, so group 6 decreased their physical activity levels early on in life, and group 7 decreased their physical activity levels later on in life. So now I will go into the results. So I'm going to show you the demographic tables, which shows the demographics at baseline across the groups. The purpose of this table is to show that we identified that there were differences at baseline across the groups, and this is why we adjust for these confounding variables in our model. So for example, you'll see that there were more males in both the maintainers and decreaser groups compared to the increasers. And the decreasers also had higher red meat intake and smoking status compared to the maintainers and increasers. So because of these differences at baseline, we adjust for them in our models. I will now talk about the hazard ratios, which show the association between the physical activity trajectories throughout life and colon cancer risk. So we found that compared to those who maintained consistently low levels of physical activity, those who met physical activity guidelines and went above physical activity guidelines were at a significantly decreased risk of colon cancer, with those who met guidelines at a 13% decreased risk. Increasers also followed this similar trend where they were also at a significant decreased risk of colon cancer compared to those who maintained consistently low levels, with those who increased later on in life at an 11% decreased risk of colon cancer. However, decreasers were at a significantly increased risk of colon cancer, with those who decreased their physical activity levels early on in life at a 13% increased risk. So just to recap what I just discussed, we found that those who maintained and increased physical activity levels throughout their life course were at a significant decreased risk of colon cancer. So physical activity was protective. However, those who decreased physical activity were at a significantly increased risk of colon cancer. Some strengths of this study were that we had a large prospective sample. We also had healthy participants at baseline and followed them for colon cancer over time. And we used physical activity trajectories, or those data-driven clusters, to assess patterns of physical activity throughout the life course. Some limitations were that this data was self-reported, so there is potential for misreporting. And we also had less underrepresented minority groups and education levels compared to that of the general population. So the take-home message is that consistent levels of physical activity throughout life is most protective of colon cancer risk. And increasing physical activity levels, especially from low levels, is also really important to reduce risk of colon cancer. Therefore, it's crucial that we promote physical activity for all ages and ability levels throughout life to best support the health and well-being for all people. In this study, we found that meeting physical activity guidelines and going above physical activity guidelines was protective of colon cancer risk. However, future studies should look into that exact dosage of physical activity that's needed to mitigate colon cancer risk. Also, it is critical to look into whether or not there is a period in life where inactive and sedentary behavior effects are irreversible. I would like to acknowledge a couple people who helped me out on this study, including my advisor, Dr. Sarah Keetle, and those at the National Cancer Institute. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open to any questions you may have. Remember to stay safe and stay healthy.